Welcome once again to the Upper Room. Great to be with you. And today we're going to talk about something I'm excited to talk about, but it's also not easy to talk about. Let me start this way. I don't believe that there's ever been a time, maybe in the history of the world, where there's been such mass confusion, mass chaos, if you will. And that is Satan's bread and butter. That's his go-to. And I want to start with a discussion question. What do you think I mean by that statement I just made? That there may have never been a time with greater chaos and confusion in the world than today. Can you give some examples? I bet you have a lot of examples you use. I just looked at the headlines from this week. All right, just peruse the headlines from this week. Let me give you 3 headlines that kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. In Germany this last week, a pastor by the name of Quentin Caesar, Caesar's actually probably a good last name for him, he in a speech to a delegation said that God is queer. A pastor, a Protestant pastor. Secondly, I noticed that there was a drag queen Bible story hour at a church in San Francisco. And finally, a 13-year-old girl and a friend were called out by a teacher because they saw a girl in their class that was pretending to be a cat, and they just asked her, how is it that you can think that you're a cat when in fact you're a girl? And the teacher called them despicable for saying such a thing. The girls actually, as this was being videoed, said, or someone behind them said, any person who thinks they're a cat is unwell. And the teacher responded with this: where did you get this idea that there are only 2 genders? She went on. Gender is not linked to the parts that you were born with. Gender is about how you identify. Okay, so that's in schools. There's 3 examples of mass chaos, mass confusion about a true north, a truth in general. And so that's where we go now. You know that we're in a series called The Habits of the Heart, and we've talked about the wall of truth and the wall of discipline and the wall of discernment, and now we finally put that last wall up. Remember, these are figurative or spiritual walls. They're not actual walls, and we're not trying to keep people out, but it is a place where we can protect our heart while our heart is being trained to godliness. And so the 4th wall is the wall of identity. And I've got to tell you, 25 years ago when we wrote this curriculum, the wall of identity was, well, it was necessary, but we didn't feel it was that important. Today, as you know from the story I just told you, identity is a real problem. Identity is a real question. Identity, or the lack thereof, has caused such problems in our society and specifically in families that this wall really becomes essential as we close out our series on the habits of the heart. Hopefully you can tell that we're having a little fireside chat here, and it actually will come into play. I've told you before that I grew up here in Western Colorado, but before my freshman year of high school, our family moved to the Olympic Peninsula of the state of Washington. Actually, it's just a little ways from Olympia, Washington, and I experienced there something I had never experienced before. Especially as I got towards getting my driver's license, I found out about something that did not exist here in Western Colorado, that is not just in existence in the state of Washington in the Pacific Northwest, but it is pervasive. And what I'm talking about is fog. Fog. I didn't even know what that was about, but fog and what comes with it in the wintertime is what's called black ice. Now, people around here talk about black ice. They don't know what black ice is. Black ice is simply transparent ice that you can never see. So it's so much more dangerous. The pavement actually looks dry as you're driving, but it's got a sheet of ice on it. More cars than I can count went off the side of the road, including mine at one point, because of the black ice, but that happens because the fog settles onto the asphalt. But it's not just the black ice, it is the fog that keeps you from seeing beyond the front of your car sometimes. And it is just so disturbing, and I don't miss it. And the rare times when we're back up there and we experience it again, I remember how much I just detested the fog and the thickness of it. And oh, what a great feeling when that fog lifts, when it clears finally, and you find out it's actually a beautiful day. That fog is going to be the metaphor for what we're talking about with the wall of identity. A fog, a dense, dangerous fog has settled in on our culture. And the question becomes, how can our heart discern how to see through the fog, how to make it through to the point where the fog lifts and we can see clearly once again, especially when it comes to our identity, who we are. By the way, when we lived in California, we had the same problem in the San Joaquin Valley. The fog can get so dense, they can have these lengthy pileups on I-5 coming down that valley because of that fog. It truly is dangerous. And I'm telling you that the fog surrounding people's identity is dangerous, and we're going to deal with it in a few lessons here in the wall of identity. Brandon Showalter is a journalist, and he has worked hand in hand with the Summit Ministries right on the Front Range of Colorado. And I want to tell you what he's been investigating since 2016, and that is this whole transgender confusion that has arisen. He became greatly alarmed when he started getting emails and notes from parents who were panicking. They didn't know what to do. Many of them had sent their kids off to college, and their kids, while at college, had been brainwashed into the transgender movement, and they themselves then took steps that the parents did not even know about, starting chemical castrations, mutilating their bodies to transfer to a different gender. So what I want to do is give you a lengthy quote from Showalter, who has been studying this phenomenon, something we could not have ever imagined 10, 20, 30 years ago and beyond. And he has been shocked at how many parents have contacted him over the years, just bewildered, befuddled, and scared to death about what has happened to their kids. Here's what he says. Over the years, I've lost count of how many moms and dads have called me absolutely devastated at the end of their rope because within 30 minutes of a telehealth consultation, their daughters and sons are given drugs that could render them sterile, or they're encouraged to have surgeries that will leave their bodies disfigured. They're living in a world of confusion, what I'm calling the fog, the dense fog of our culture. He goes on. They sent them off to a university and they became indoctrinated. I've had some of them in my home for dinner to try and console them as they're just grieving. This has just devoured and shattered their families, and that's not being hyperbolic, meaning I'm not exaggerating this at all. He goes on. Families are distraught and confused. Americans as a whole, according to polling by Summit Ministries, seem baffled by the whole issue. 2/3 of Americans, he says, say that they do not think that transgender identity is a normal, healthy lifestyle. 72% say that it should not be taught in schools. 90% say that gender alteration drugs and surgeries should not be performed on minors. Yet, for the gender ideologues and the moneyed players who set this top-down systematic destruction of sex in motion, the instinctual clarity most people have about the issue is misguided. The confusion that gender ideology creates is a feature, not a bug of their entire project. If none of this makes any reasonable sense to you, well, that is precisely the point. At the root, we are dealing with a postmodern rejection of reality that is bound to fail. And then he concludes by saying the question is, how many lives must be shattered before this experiment fails, as it surely will? I'm here to tell you that's a great description of mass confusion and chaos in our culture. The fog has settled and people can't find their way. And it is about this idea of who are we and what is our life supposed to be about. Now, our reaction to this is essential, that it be in line with Jesus. And here's what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 9, verse 36. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. He sets the tone, doesn't he? We are to have compassion on these people who are lost in the fog and can't find their way. We're not, again, battling against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, demonic forces that are destroying human beings. And so we take on this wall of identity, and I have a unique way for us to start today. For our first lesson on the wall of identity, it's one simple idea. And when we get to it, it's going to take us a little time. When we get to it, you might say, I knew that. But my question would be, do you really know it? Not just intellectually, but do you know it experientially? We're going to get there by looking at two different interactions that God had with man, certain men, and then take that to the level of understanding where do we begin on the wall of identity. So I ask you to turn to the book of Exodus, and this story is a famous story, and it'll be easy for you to just kind of shut off as I read through it. Please do not do that, because we're going to look at one very specific idea that comes out of this story when Moses sees the burning bush. So here we go, Exodus chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in the flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see the strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. That'll come into play later, much later in Moses' story, when he wants to see God, and God will tell him, you cannot see my face and live. Remember, he sets him in the cleft of the rock up on the mountain later on, and he passes by, and Moses can only see his hindquarters, and even that leaves a glow on his face. So he's afraid to look at the face of God. Later he wants more of God, so he says, can I see your face? God says, you cannot do that and live. That talks about the incredible glory of God. But let me break. That brings us to our location. We are by a fire that is not holy ground. All right? Moses found himself on holy ground, and one of the ways he knew it was there was a fire that was not consuming the bush. So we have a bush behind me, but we have a fire, but the fire is consuming, would consume that bush. It is consuming firewood. Okay, with that fire in mind, understanding where I sit here is not holy ground. There's nothing special about it other than it's just outside our bedroom window. That's special to us, but it's not holy ground. So Moses is 80 years, give or take a year or two, 80 years old. You think by now he'd seen it all. But now he's seeing something he's never seen, and he's shocked by it. So we're going to pick up the story down in verse 11. But between verse 6 and verse 11, God tells him why he's talking to him, that he wants to pull the nation of Israel, his people, out of Egypt for the first time in 430 years. And now we pick up in verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I'll be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, and here's the kind of the crux of the matter here today, I am who I am. This is what you're to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. All right, discussion question. What do you think he means by naming himself, I am who I am? Have a great discussion. We know that names mean things. They used to really mean things, maybe not so much today. But little Brandon Smith, that was his name, was maybe 3-4 years old, and he was supposed to be going to bed. And for the 22nd time, his mom said, "Okay, I've had enough. I want you to go in, get in bed, and if you get out again, there will be severe consequences." Read into that, spanking. Remember the days when spankings were in? So she really threatened him, for the 22nd time or whatever. Don't come out again. I don't want to hear you call me mom again. And so 5 minutes went by. It was all good. And then she heard this voice at the top of the stairs. And little Brandon was saying, "Mrs. Smith, could I have a cup of water, please?" You see, names mean something, and to God, giving himself this name is enormous. And it's really important that we understand it. So what is it about God's name that helps us recognize who he is? It's very important that we recognize who he is. Speaking of nighttime endeavors with young children, we several weeks ago had all 3 of our grandkids for the night, overnight, and it's always a hoot. And the 2 boys are right next to our room, and so it was by now like 9:30, 10 o'clock. They went to bed like at 8:30, and they were still talking. So Christy went in to say, it's time to calm down. That same thing, but I know she didn't threaten them. But she's talking to them. Meanwhile, the only lights on were a light in our room and a night light in the bathroom down the hall. And I wanted to say goodnight to Caleb across the hall. So I walked across, gym shorts on. That's all I had on were some gym shorts. And as I walked across, as Christy's talking to Keaton, Keaton looks over her shoulder and says, "Who's the naked guy?" Recognizing somebody is really important. I think she said he lives in my room with me. Anyway, recognizing God. How do you recognize God? God here gives Moses and the nation of Israel an opportunity to recognize him. Moses recognized by the burning of a bush that never burnt up that he was on holy ground, but now he was given a name to attach to that power behind the burning bush that wasn't burning up, that power that would lead them out of Egypt. And the name was, actually he gave 3 names if you really heard them. There was I am who I am, there was I am, and then there was Yahweh has sent me to you. This is my name forever, Yahweh. Here's what's really interesting. All 3 of those references that God gives in verses 14 and 15, all 3 of them have the same basic Hebrew root word, and it is H-A-Y-E-H, Heya. And that Hebrew root word can come to mean all of those things. I am that I am, and Yahweh. And you may know that Yahweh was God's name throughout the Old Testament. It was used more than any other name. It's not a generic thing like a power or a God. That would be Elohim, I think. A total of 6,828 times in the Old Testament, the name of God appears as Yahweh. Okay, and you probably know it was so holy that they only had the consonants, and they couldn't, they would fill in some vowels, but they wouldn't say it, but they could refer to him by his name, Yahweh. Only 2,600 times in the Old Testament is the word Elohim, which is a generic name for God, is used. So much more often we have this Yahweh, this I am. It is the name he wanted to be called, and we want to delve into what does that name mean. So I want to give you 7 implications of that name, okay? They're kind of built into that name as we see it throughout the Old Testament, all right? And we're going to pretty much fly through them in your discussion time. You can go back and talk about each one of them, but it's important that we know what these implications are and that we really have a clear understanding of the name God uses for himself when he talks to Moses. The first implication is that God, Yahweh, I am, is personal and present. All right, personal and present. And we see that with Moses. We saw it sometimes a burning bush, sometimes a ladder extending. Remember Jacob and the angels ascending and descending. It's an extension to God. These moments, these places in time, but he is present and he's personal. really important. Now you may say, well, that's Old Testament stuff. He doesn't appear in things that are on fire but don't burn up. Yes, today we have a different personal presence of God, and Jesus introduced us to his presence in our lives. I want to make sure that we see that once again. I've shown it to you before. We go to John chapter 14. We're back in the upper room. And again, Jesus says, I will ask the Father, and he'll give you another helper or encourager, is what the word can mean, to be with you forever. Even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you. Talk about a personal presence. He goes on, these things I have spoken to you while I am still with you, but the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you. So he'll help you, he'll encourage you, he'll teach you, he'll remind you. Talk about a personal presence in our lives. We don't need burning bushes and ladders anymore. Later on in the upper room, in chapter 16, verse 7, we read, nevertheless, I tell you the truth. It is to your advantage that I go away. Now, when he said that, his disciples had to say, what do you mean it's to our advantage? We're getting to walk with the Son of God. He says, it's to your advantage that I go away. For if I do not go away, the Helper, he's already talked about him, will not come to you, but if I go, I'll send him to you. And then in chapter 16, verse 13, he says, when the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth. For he will not speak on his own authority, but whatever he hears, he will speak. And he will declare to you the things that are to come. All right, so he will now guide us. He'll guide these disciples. He guides us. Talk about a personal presence in our lives. We don't need burning bushes that don't burn up anymore. But that in the name of God is this personal presence. I am with you. The second part of his name is showing us that he is preeminent. And preeminent means that no one came before him. You know, I had parents, you had parents. I get genes passed down to me. I got habits, some good, not so good, maybe passed down to me. It all goes back before me. For you, it does the same. You have traits from your parents, which probably came from your grandparents and great-grandparents. God is not like that. He's preeminent. There is no one before him. Nothing was passed down to him. Before him, there was no before him. Okay, so he's preeminent. You need to know that. I am is a statement that means always have been, always will be. So he's preeminent. The third element we see in the name that God gives to himself is that he is persistent and predictable. He's persistent and predictable. I always have been, I am, I always will be. And we see other passages that he shows he does not change. This is really important in these days. Malachi chapter 3, verse 6, I, Yahweh, do not change. James 1:17, with him there is no variation or shadow due to change. And then Hebrews 13:8, he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Now, why is that important? So that characteristic of the great I am is so important because today, in the fog in which we live, many people, even inside the church, are saying, oh, God doesn't believe that anymore. If God understood the way we would evolve or become, he wouldn't be saying that today. God is the same. He's the same God. He doesn't change. He's not fickle. He's not flighty. And we need to understand that about I am. And then the fourth element of the I am name is that God is powerful. He is the inexhaustible source of energy. All energy flows from him. You know, when he rested on the seventh day, it wasn't because he was tired. A lot of us say, oh, he worked hard for 6 days, now he rested because he's tired. We should rest too. No, he didn't need to rest because he was tired. He wasn't exhausted. Creating a universe and an earth and human beings is not tiring to God. He's an inexhaustible power of energy. I believe he set aside the seventh day to show us how important it is we set aside a day that is holy, that is separate, and fully committed to recognizing him and what he's done for us in the other 6 days. Okay, so that power is always there. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 28. Have you never heard? Have you never understood? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of all the earth. He never grows weak or weary. No one can measure the depths of his understanding. He is that all-powerful, omnipotent God that again is being denied today, that he is not all-powerful, but that is who he is when he says, I am that I am. Again, Acts chapter 17, verse 28, when Paul is teaching in Athens to all the people who live by all the thousands of gods, he says, for in him, in Jesus, in the great I am, he says, we live and move and exist. We exist in him, not apart from him, in him. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. He's quoting a Cretan poet here, so they will identify, they've heard this before. And he goes on and says, and since this is true, your poet got it right. We shouldn't think of God as an idol designed by craftsmen for gold and silver or stone. He cannot be crafted, handcrafted, and be all-powerful. There is no graven image, there is no carved image, there is no image in this world that is all-powerful. Only God, the great I am. Now we go to the fifth element of the I am statement of God about himself, and it is that he is precise. He's precise. He is not subject to feelings, especially our feelings and our desires. And that's a big deal, because in this day and age, many people, even people inside the church, are saying, I just don't feel like God is this, he's not a good God, I desire that God be this way for me. This I can make God in my own image is the idea about this, and he is not that. He's very precise. It's objective. He is who he is, and he doesn't change based on how I feel about him or what my desires are. Do you get that? That's what's packed into this I am that I am. And then the sixth element of the I am statement by God is that he is permanent, okay? We must conform to him, and that kind of goes along with the last one, but he does not conform to us. We conform to him. Isaiah chapter 64, verse 8, and yet, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay and you are the potter. We are all formed by your hand. He does not form based on what our pressures on him are about. And again in Romans 9:20, Paul goes back to that idea, and he says, who are you, a mere human being, to argue with God? Should the thing that was created say to the one who created it, why have you made me like this? Verse 21, when a potter makes jars out of clay, doesn't he have the right to use the same lump of clay to make one jar for decoration and another one to throw the garbage into? Isn't that the way it is with the maker? So don't start thinking that you are permanent and he's not. He's the permanent one. We conform to his forming of us, to what he wants. And now finally, the seventh identifying principle behind the I am statement of God is that he is personified in Jesus. Jesus becomes the exact representation of God. It's really important. And to show you how Jesus personified him, 7 times he has I am statements, right? I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life. I am. He is, when he says that, undeniably identifying with Yahweh. And then in John chapter 8, verse 56, he says this, your father, talking about the Pharisees, to the Pharisees, your father Abraham rejoiced that he was able to see my day. He saw it and was glad. The Jews then said to him, you are not yet 50 years old, and yet you have seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. There it is. I am Yahweh. I am that I am. The Father and I are one. And that statement is what gets him put on the cross. You cannot be blasphemous like that, the Pharisees believe. And so that's interaction number 1 with Moses. And we learn about God. We learn a lot about God in that one interaction. I am that I am. Tell them, Yahweh sent you, the God of your fathers in the past. I'll be with you in the future. That's the all-encompassing Yahweh, all right? That's the first interaction. For the second interaction, quickly, we turn to Isaiah chapter 6. It was the year that King Uzziah died. It was actually 740 BC. King Uzziah was a great king, but at the end of his life, he became prideful. I won't go into the exact situation, but he became prideful, and God struck him with leprosy, and he died. But he had been a great king, and so when he died, there was great mourning and weeping in the nation of Israel, and the people who took his place did not measure up at all. And so it's at that moment in time when Isaiah goes into the temple, and we pick it up in Isaiah chapter 6, starting in verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, angels, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 wings they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another. What were they calling out? Holy, holy, holy. The whole earth is full of his glory. Now here's what you got to get out of what the angels are singing and shouting. That is, the word holy is very special. It means a cut above. It means separate, a cut above. Unlike anything or anyone else in all of the universe. Holy. But they say it 3 times. When Jesus repeated truly, truly 2 times, it meant that he was putting great emphasis on the fact that what I'm telling you is true. So if 2 is a great emphasis, 3, there is no greater emphasis that could be put. So it's the idea that 3 times they call out that he is holy, and the whole universe is filled with his glory. There's none like him. The 20th century German scholar by the name of Rudolf Otto really investigated this idea of holiness and what it means. So Rudolf Otto's summary of holiness is that phrase, awful mystery. And I think he got a lot of it from what happens next here in the Isaiah account of being in the presence of God. We pick it up at verse 4. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, Isaiah cries. I am ruined. That word literally means I'm coming apart. I'm being pulled apart at the seams. Have you ever heard anybody use that phrase? I'm just falling apart. I'm being pulled apart. That's what he is saying, is that I am gonna die. I'm not gonna live through this experience. And verse 5 goes on, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. I have witnessed God himself, and it's gonna destroy me. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. Remember, they would do sacrifices, and it's as though he reached back into this fire pit and brought some coal and put it on his lips. And then the angel says, see, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And he said, here am I, send me. 2 things about that. One, I never noticed before. Who will go for us? The Father is basically saying, it's not just me, it's my Son, it's my Spirit. We will send you. And then just like Moses, he is commissioned and he says, I will go. Moses kind of drug his feet, made some excuses. Not Isaiah. This wasn't standing next to a bush, that was not being consumed. This was experiencing the very presence of God in the most terrifying sense. And he says, of course, I will do whatever you need me to do. So what's going on here? We are at the apex of this lesson. This is what this lesson is about, and I want to demonstrate it to you from a great quote from R.C. Sproul from his book, The Holiness of God. And here's how he puts it. For the first time in his life, Isaiah really understood who God was. At the same instant, for the first time, Isaiah really understood who Isaiah was. And that's the point. The wall of identity must begin here. I must have a real understanding of who God is. Now, we will never fully understand God, but he did interact with Moses, with Isaiah, and as we mentioned, Jesus said he interacts with us through his Spirit. But it's only within that glimpse of who God really is that we find out who we really are. Let me give you another example of that. Peter is fishing. He's throwing his nets out all night with his buddies over the side of the boat, and they get nothing. He's discouraged. There's nothing worse than a fisherman that didn't get a catch. And then Jesus appears and says, hey, why don't you try the other side of the boat? It's early in the morning, and Peter, being the professional and really looking at Jesus as though you're not a professional fisherman, you can see the rolling of the eyes from Peter, and he says, but Lord, we've been fishing all night long. And then, without saying another word, it must have been that look that he got. He said, okay, so he says, we'll appease you. You're not a fisherman. You don't know this area. You're really good with healing people, but this is really, really out of your area, Jesus. And they throw it over the other side of the boat, the nets, and they are so filled with fish that the nets begin to burst and tear apart. And then we see it in Luke 5:8. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man. In that moment, Peter's identity shifted to reality. You see, he always believed his real story was, I'm a professional fisherman. That's my identity. In this moment, when he's in the very presence of God Almighty, he realizes it and says, it's not that I'm a fisherman anymore, it's that I'm a sinner and I cannot be in your presence. Please go. That's the crux of this lesson. I know you know it intellectually. Most likely, you know intellectually what we're talking about. But you need to know it experientially. And that is this, that we cannot understand our identity unless we first understand God's identity. Our identity must be seen in the shadow of the identity of who God is. Now, this is a really important little detail, and it's not really a detail. It is the thrust of the matter that we saw both with Moses and with Isaiah, and that is this. God is holy. He is set apart. He's not like anything else, anyone else in the universe. And it is his holiness that is the umbrella under which all his other traits that we come to find out about exist. In other words, God is love, but it's a holy love. It's not a love like we experience on this earth. God is just. God is kind. God is patient. God is all those things, but they're all under the umbrella of his holiness. You see, he is set apart until we see that set apart nature, that he is different from us. But it is his holiness then that we now ascribe all the other understandings of God to. And it is now under that umbrella of holiness that we must live. And as he will later say, be holy for I am holy. Come be separate with me. Don't do life like everybody else. And what is going on in this world? Fog, distortion, absolute discouragement and lostness. He says it doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to be lost in the distortion of fog. Things will get clear when you join me in my holiness, in my separateness, in my not like everything else kind of perspective. You see, the truth of the matter is he is holy, we are not. He is flawless, we are flawed. He never fails, we fail most of the time. That's the reality. Let's go back to those 7 attributes of the I am statement by God. God is personal and present. The truth is, I am not that personal, and I'm not always present with the people in my life. He is preeminent. I mean, there's nothing before him. For me, I can see what came before me. God is persistent and predictable. I'm flighty and I'm fickle and I change my mind all the time about things. That's not me. God is powerful. I am weak. In reality, weakness is what personifies my life. God is precise. That is, he is very objective. And I tend to live my life based on my feelings and my desires, and then I expect God to do that as well. God is permanent. I am temporary on this earth. There is absolute permanence with God. I am not like that. And everything I tend to fall in love with on this earth is not permanent. and that's a problem. And finally, God is personified in Jesus. Jesus personified God. He's the exact representation of God. And I tend to be self-interested, self-promoting, and very out of touch and aloof sometimes. I'm not personal and present like Jesus is in our lives through his Spirit now. You see, I'm nothing like God, and that's where I have to begin. God is God, I am not, because the implications are this. That means my opinions are just my opinions. That means my feelings are just my feelings. My desires are just my desires. They're not the desires of God. I am different from God. That's where my identity begins, and I need to acknowledge that, like Isaiah said. I am coming apart of the seams. I am ruined because I am not like him. And so I certainly cannot sit in judgment of God. I certainly cannot say God is not a good God. God doesn't know what he's doing. If I were in charge, that's ludicrous. Can you see how important this beginning point is? And having established that, actually the truth is I am very important. I am very important. I'm more important than even I know. And we'll get into that. How can it be both? How can I be a fallen, fickle, flawed-filled man and yet be so important? That's what the Wall of Identity is really about. I told you 25 years ago we wrote this curriculum, and at the time the Wall of Identity seemed like, we'll throw that in, it might be important. No, now 25 years later we realize without the Wall of Identity we all are in trouble and we're all lost in the fog, and we need the fog to lift. There's a very famous woman who was born in 1910, August 26th of 1910. We came to know her eventually as Mother Teresa. And she was known as a living saint. I mean, according to the Catholic Church, you can't be a saint until you've been gone for a while, but they considered her a living saint. And yet after she left, and I believe on the day she went into heaven, it was September 5th of 1997, certainly then the fog really lifted for her. But she lived in quite a bit of fog. We found out from letters she left that were very personal, that she felt that she was not in touch with God, that she didn't feel God, that his presence was unknown to her in her life, much of the last 50 years of her life. I tell you that not to discourage you, because if Mother Teresa doesn't feel the presence of God, who will? I tell you that to remind you this is a tough one. Our identity, understanding who God is, who we are, is a tough one. It's a difficult area, and we're going to delve into it, and I'm excited about what we're going to do. But here's what I love about Mother Teresa. In spite of the fact that she did not feel close to God, that she did not always feel his presence, she maintained her calling. Even though Moses didn't feel adequate, he maintained the calling. Isaiah felt like, I'm done, I will die in this moment. He maintained the calling and said, whatever you want, I will do. Obviously, Mother Teresa did the same thing. She stuck to it to the very end. She did what God called her to the poorest of the poor, no matter how she felt. No matter whether her desires were being met, she maintained that calling. And that's part of who we really are. That's part of our identity. I'm so glad you've joined us here on not very holy ground. The fire is consuming the wood behind me. It's going to start to fizzle out here in a little while because of its consumption. This is different than the place where Moses was and the place where Isaiah was. It's different than what Jacob experienced. But God's presence is real in your life because his Holy Spirit is real in you. Jesus promised it. So we'll pursue this very important last wall of identity. We love you and love doing life with you. God bless you.